Do I look like a professor? Cause I'm gonna teach y'all something today. I can't see nothing, boy. Whew. These ain't mine, by the way. Let's get it. Okay, so today I'm going to be teaching you the exposure triangle. This is the main thing you need to know whenever you want to start shooting in manual mode. Shooting in manual mode is going to get you the most out of your camera. If you're shooting in auto mode, just don't shoot in auto mode no more. We're gonna go straight to manual mode. So put your camera in manual mode and just follow along, and I hope you learned something from this video. So one of the key components of shooting in manual mode is understanding the exposure triangle. That's your ISO, your shutter speed, and your aperture. I would say the ISO is like the most important one out of all of them because it determines how good your image looks. With a lower ISO value, you will have a much cleaner image than if you had, let's say, a higher ISO value. I would recommend keeping your ISO as low as possible. There will be some times where you will have to use a higher ISO. One way to get cleaner images with a higher ISO is by using a flash. Not necessarily the flash that comes built on your camera, but like an external flash. That'll give you much better results in getting a cleaner image with higher ISOs. What is ISO? ISO is your camera's sensitivity to light. With a lower ISO number, the lower the sensitivity to light, and the higher ISO number, the higher the sensitivity to light. So in a sense, it kind of adds artificial light to your images. If you just take out your camera, put your ISO at 100, you'll notice that it'll be much darker than if you were to raise it to, let's say, 800. Whenever you're shooting at higher ISOs, you will introduce noise in your image. And noise is pretty much like it looks like a grain. It's not really visually pleasing, but it is. Some people do prefer that style, but some people do not prefer that style. So once you decide if you like grain in your images or if you just want a nice crystal clear image, then you'll know if you need to try to keep your ISO as low as possible or if you would just want to use a higher ISO. I always recommend to just get your image as clean as possible in your camera, and if you want the grain look, just add it in post-production, not necessarily shoot at a higher ISO because you like the look of it. The next key component of the exposure triangle is shutter speed. So this is pretty much how fast your shutter light closes whenever you take a picture. So having a higher shutter speed will let in less light, but it will freeze action, versus if you have a slower shutter speed, it will let in more light because it's taking more time to close, but you can also get blur in your images whenever you use a slower shutter speed. There definitely are times when you would want to use a slower shutter speed, and there definitely are times when you would want to use a faster shutter speed. And sometimes your shutter speed really don't matter at all as long as you get the shot that you're trying to take. A rule of thumb is you at least want your shutter speed to be whatever your focal length is. So if you're shooting with, let's say, a 50mm lens, you at least want your shutter speed to be 1/50 of a second. If you're shooting at 200mm, then you want your shutter speed to be at least 200th of a second to reduce the motion blur that you would naturally get from like handshake whenever you're like holding the camera type thing. So if you're shooting sports, for example, I would say you would at least need like 1/500 of a shutter speed, but that can vary. If you're taking pictures of like high school kids, you're gonna need a much faster shutter speed than if you were taking pictures of like park league kids, because park league kids just don't move as fast as high school kids, so you can get away with a slower shutter speed. So that's something you'll just have to play around with whenever you're at the event and see what shutter speed is getting you the best results. But on the other hand, if you're just taking portrait pictures of people or family and they're like posed and they aren't moving really fast, then you can typically get away with a much slower shutter speed, like 1/250th of a second, 1/150th of a second. It just depends on the moving subject or just the subject in general, and also your focal length. The final key component of the exposure triangle is your aperture. Your aperture is pretty much how, I guess, how do you explain aperture? Okay, that's a little technical for a lot of people. So pretty much your aperture is your, I got it. All right, so this is aperture. This is a wide aperture. This is aperture at f1.8, and now we're closing it down to f5.6 and f16. As you can see, it's very small. So the smaller the f number, this is f1.8, the more light it would let in. And the smaller the f number is like f5.6, and it will let in less light. So that's one of the key things to take away. f1.8, f5.6, 1.8, 5.6. So the thing to take away from this is the lower your f number, the more light that will come into your camera, and the higher the f number, the less light that will come into your camera. And the lower your f number, the more blurry the background will be, and the higher the f number, the more of the background will be in focus. I'm gonna just take y'all into my camera to try to explain this a little bit better. So this is the back of my camera. I'm gonna try to teach y'all how to take good photos in manual. This is more so for people with a DSLR. If you have a mirrorless camera, whenever you like make changes to the shutter speed, first off, shutter speed, aperture, ISO. So as you can see, as I'm making changes to my shutter speed, my images is getting darker and brighter with my shutter speed changing. If you have a mirrorless camera, as you make changes, you will see this. But if you have a DSLR camera, whenever you make these changes, like you will not have the exposure changing as well. This is what a mirrorless camera does. Like you can always see the changes you make. That's why I said in my previous video that it is easier for people who use mirrorless cameras to learn how to use it manually, because they can always see the changes they make. So let me put it to the use of someone with a DSLR. This is how someone with a DSLR will typically see their images whenever they're looking through the viewfinder. This little thingy up here, that's the viewfinder. So whenever you have a DSLR, like no matter what changes you make, as you can see, the image isn't getting darker or brighter. So we're about to apply the exposure triangle to get a well exposed image, and let's see if this is going to help you guys. If you got a DSLR camera and this is what you're looking at, you don't know how the image is going to turn out. So I'm going to show you one way to find out. So you have this thing, this little dotted line right here, and you have 1, 2, 3, then you have negative 1, 2, 3. Whenever you have it on this line right in the middle, that means that you should have a correctly nice exposed image, which is meaning it shouldn't be too dark or too bright. So I'm gonna focus here, take a picture, and now we're gonna go back and look at it. And it's still a little dark for my liking anyway. One way to fix that is ISO. Well, no, ISO is like the last thing we'll touch. I'm on a tripod, so I can shoot with the slow shutter speed. My aperture is at f1.8, that's as far as it goes. So the next thing we'll mess with is the shutter speed. So we'll mess with the shutter speed. We'll see what 1/40th is like. So now it's saying that we're roughly 1 stop overexposed. Take a picture, and that is a much better image than before. So we got that one and this one, that one, this one. Another thing to keep in mind with these dotted lines, well, with the numbers on the dotted lines, which this is saying 1 stop, 2 stop, 3 stop, -1 stop, -2 stops, -3 stops. So let's say we were to read our exposure meter. So if we were to read our meter right now, it's saying that we are about -2 stops underexposed. So without even having to like take a picture, then review that picture. So without even having to do that, we know that we at least need to bring in 2 stops of light. So whenever you need to bring in stops of light, there are 3 ways to do it, which is ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. So if you take the ISO, for example, if you double the ISO, so if you go to 200, that's 1 stop of light. And if you double 200, so go to 400, that's another stop of light. And if you double 400, so go to 800, that's another stop of light. 800 to 1600, another stop of light, and so on and so forth. So that is how you gauge stops of light with your ISO. So right now we're at ISO 400. I'm sorry, we're at ISO 100. So we hit ISO, go to 200, that's one stop, double. So now we're gonna double 200 to get another stop. 400, that's another stop. So now we read our meter, we're close to correctly exposed, but we'll go here, double 400 to get another stop, that's 800. And now we're roughly almost one stop over. So now we'll focus, take a picture, and we got a good image. So that's one way to gauge your exposure whenever you're having to manually meter your exposure. All right, so we're gonna drop our ISO back down though. We're gonna go to ISO 200. Nah, we'll go back to 100. All right, so we're back to roughly 2 stops underexposed again, right? We're gonna keep our aperture where it's at. And now we are going to change it with the shutter speed. So the shutter speed is pretty much the same as the ISO. To get a stop of light in shutter speed, you're either gonna double the number or cut the number in half. We're at 1/400. So to get a stop of light from here, we're gonna go to 1/200. To get a stop of light from 1/200, we're gonna cut that in half. So that's 1/100. And now we'll check our exposure meter. And once again, we're almost correctly exposed. And to get that final stop of light, we're going to go to 1/50th, which is cutting that in half, getting another stop. Take the picture, view it, and as you can see, these images are identical, which they have different settings, like ISO 100 and 1/50. So as you can see, this image and the previous image are identical, but they have different values. This one is ISO 100, shutter speed 1/50. This one is shutter speed 1/50, ISO 800, but it's the same exposure, just different settings. Those are 2 ways to gauge your exposure just by reading your meter here. So let's say that we're gonna mess with the aperture. So we'll go back to ISO, we'll go up to 1600, and that'll be our starting point. And we'll go back to aperture f1.8. So at aperture f1.8, shutter speed 1/50 and ISO 1600, we can see by this little triangle right here that we are more than 3 stops overexposed. So I'm just taking an image anyway, take an image, view it, and it's very bright, as you can see. So it's very overexposed. So to fix that, so we're gonna change it with the aperture just because I've showed you how to change it with all the other methods at this point. The thing about aperture is you kind of have to memorize it because there is a mathematical equation, but it's not something that you'll just be able to get without a calculator type thing. The thing to keep in mind whenever you want to change stops with your aperture is, which my camera pretty much has it have it labeled for you. The big lines are a stop of light. So from f2 to f2.8 is a stop, from f2.8 to f4 is a stop, from f4 to f5.6 is a stop, from f5.6 to f8 is a stop, f8 to f11, and so on and so forth. But as long as you can remember that from f5.6 to f4, f4 to f2.8, f2.8 to f2, as long as you can remember that those are stops of light, then you typically will be good to go. So I'm gonna go to f2 since that's easier. We know that we need to go at least 3 stops of light. So f2 to f2.8, that's one stop. 2.8 to f4, that's another stop. F4 to 5.6 is another stop. And now we're gonna read our meter. So it's saying that we're like roughly a little bit more than 1 stop overexposed. So we'll go up to f7.1, we'll go to f8. So now we're at f8 and we're like almost perfectly exposed according to the meter. We'll take an image, see what we get. And we got a pretty decent looking image. That was like way overexposed, and we got that. That is kind of how you would go about getting your exposure whenever you're looking through your viewfinder. Because most people don't really know how to get a good image whenever they just look through the viewfinder without having to look at the back of the screen. If you got a DSLR, that's something you'll just have to get used to and get good at. But it does take a little practice. So with a little practice though, I mean, you can get good. Definitely learning your camera and the settings will definitely help. But I just want to show y'all one more thing. The last thing I'm going to talk about with the aperture is the depth of field, or the blurry background, so to say. If you notice, if we take a look at this last image I took at f8, you can perfectly read my sign in the background. How are we going to fix that? So for one, we're going to drop our ISO back down to, we'll go to 100 and see what we can do. So we'll go ISO to 100. Check our meter. As you can see, it's saying we're like -3 stops underexposed. So we're going to drop our shutter speed, 5.6, that's 1 stop. F4, that's 2 stops. 2.8, that's 3 stops. And we'll just go to F2. And as you can see, my meter is moving as I'm changing. And we're like almost correctly exposed. And we'll go to 1.8 just because. And now we'll take an image. And there you go. So if you look at this background versus this background, you'll see the difference. Didn't much really change in the exposure, but the depth of field changed a lot. That is kind of how you can look at the two. So if you have an image where you want to get multiple people in focus, then you need to shoot at a higher f-stop. But if you want the blurry background effect, then having a low f-stop will be more pleasing, or it will look better. So one thing I'm gonna do to get the background even more blurry without changing any of my settings is I'm gonna bring the Tiger closer to the camera lens. So the closer you get to an object, the more blurry the background will be. All right, so I moved the Tiger a little bit closer. We'll take that image. All right, so we got f8 and f1.8, and you see that difference. And I probably moved the Tiger maybe 4 inches closer, and we get from here to here. So there you have it. I hope you were able to learn something from this video. I apologize if it was a little long. I just tried to get through it the best way that I could. If I did not explain something good enough, just let me know down in the comments, or just send me a message on social media. And until next time, man, I'm out. Tell the camera you ready to eat. Say, I gone, I ready to go eat. I'm ready, ready.